sexual relationships. We may do some in the book reading because there's just some meat and potatoes laws that may be worth reviewing. But I'll start off by saying some, which I think is some innovative or just important points to make. Going back to Leviticus 18, verse 6, it says, "Any man shall not approach his close relative to uncover nakedness." That's in the English. Now, there's this idea of not to approach, and there's also some other verses and some other bases to it. But the point is that we discussed in the past the concept that not only is actual intercourse in forbidden unions with certain people that is forbidden to be with, and obviously relatives, adultery, etc. It's not just the intercourse itself, but also the actions leading up to it will be either forbidden based on Noahide law itself, or it will be something that will be, in other words, either it's forbidden because, again, based on the more detailed, more stringent approach, because it's one of the sexual prohibitions to Israel, and therefore, since it's one of the seven, all the ways that it affects, it is applied to the children of Israel, to the Jewish people, it will also apply to the nations. Otherwise, it's a rational addition because, look, let's face it, the way sexuality works, once a person becomes involved in the introductory acts to it, the chances are that it will end up in actual intercourse. So it's senseless to just forbid, in other words, rationally, even if it doesn't say so, but by saying that these forbidden unions, are forbidden, and that the punishment, that it's very severe, that it's something very, very serious. Then you have to create fences and also forbid, behavior that leads to it. It's just, otherwise it's not functional, and it's poor advice. In other words, if we focus only on saying, look, you can do everything, but the result will be that many people will not, or maybe the majority of people will not be adhering to this because you're just letting things get too close. So I wanted to take this a couple of steps further. In other words, what I'm basically saying is, as a society, not only in the Jewish community or in the Jewish nation, is there a need to create fences, but this also applies to the nations also, particularly when it comes to sexual relationships, because of the nature, because of the particular magnetism and power that sexual attraction has over people, and the sexual drive has with people. It's necessary to create fences. We were talking last week about the idea that I think it was actually one of the thoughts that we circulated about how to look at sexuality. Is that something that is just a nice idea, or is that actually part and parcel of this prohibition? In other words, my point is, it could also be a rational offshoot or branch of the prohibition itself, because if the point is that it could be in order really to have a pristine, or how should I say, in order to properly make sure that young people particularly, keep sexuality in its proper parameters and not to violate forbidden sexual unions, then they have to have the proper perspective on sexuality. Otherwise, it will lead to eventually lead to forbidden acts. Again, it's important to view the seven laws as a whole. So if you put sexual prohibitions together with the obligation to institute and to install courts of law, which basically means that you have to influence your society as a whole to follow these laws. I believe this is part of that, is in other words, to persuade people and to communicate with people the special quality of sexuality and special weight of sexuality. There were some interesting podcasts online that discuss the issue in relation to modernity and how sexuality has changed, and how a lot of it has to do with the fact that responsibility, the risk of having children, particularly for the woman, risk of her becoming pregnant, has been removed from the equation, and how the weight of that has really changed sexuality, and not for the better. You take the responsibility out of it, you take the seriousness out of it, which really is there. And that what happens is that, again, there is this drive. And again, really the drive is for the same purpose to a great extent, to the fullest extent. In fact, you can say that even the pleasure that's involved in it is in order to create the proper union between people, because what we enjoy and what we have pleasure with bonds us. We connect it to things that we like and enjoy, that we are happy with. So the point is that the pleasure is supposed to be in a place with a person that we intend to unify with. Mystically, also, the idea of pleasure is, it's kind of a mystical and spiritual unity, or how should I say, that it represents. So in other words, basically what I'm saying to you is that, for example, Torah study is supposed to provide pleasure. And that is a union between God and the soul and so on. So this idea of unity and pleasure go in its highest and most purest form also involves pleasure, a godly pleasure. But nevertheless, there's some connection there. So my point is that viewing sexuality in terms of bringing souls into the world, and also promoting marriage, even is also part and parcel of creating a fence that people shouldn't come to do fall into these forbidden unions. Because with a person's sexual drive, if they're not encouraged to be married, they're going to, exercise that drive elsewhere, and that could lead and likely will lead to some type of forbidden union. If not with someone else's partner, then with relatives, because if a person is unsatisfied, the drive is not properly made use of in the way God wants us to, then it could end up in the wrong place. For example, among the people, God forbid, in our own household, people we're around all the time, God forbid. But the point is why? Because it needs to be satisfied in the proper, holy, good, divinely planned way. And if it isn't, it will be corrupted. So even if we understand that Noahides don't have an obligation to have children, but they do have an obligation to create a fence around these prohibitions. I mean, that's clear. So it seemed like at a very minimum, that would be another reason for marriage. We discussed last time, of course, settling the world, and then included in that is also the idea of continuing the species, which is God's will, that all the species he's created should continue. So those things apply. But here I'm saying something even more just halakhically clear, is that just since the scripture and the tradition clearly state that this is one of the 7 laws of sexual prohibitions, being married is one of the means in order to avoid coming to forbidden sexual behavior. So it's all connected. And as I said last time, when a person has to really, in Hasidic thinking, there's no middle ground really. And I guess you have to see in your own lives how this plays out, your own experiences. Some people is maybe more acute than others, maybe more so with males. But the point is that person should be busy with positive and holy things, because, in other words, there's no neutral. I'm just neutral. I'm neither, on the side that is of impurity or purity. It's either one or the other. And so if the person is sexual energy is not in the right, should be in the right place and towards, in a marriage and involved with children, etc. Okay. So another thing is that according to this, I mentioned this point, but I want to emphasize that it would be part of the obligation of the Noahide community, certainly as a community, because as a community, they would have enough funds or ability to persuade and propagate the value and dignity of the nuclear family. So that's it seems like that would be the relationship between this prohibition and the obligation to institute courts. In other words, to have such a society that, in other words, the idea of instituting courts, basically, what is the underlying point about it? It's about that you have to have courts to implement the other laws. In other words, it's not just about you. You have to make sure that there's leadership and that it's actually policed and spreads and is maintained on the societal level, not just on the individual level. So that's why it seems as an offshoot of this commandment, this prohibition is also an obligation to persuade others and to talk in a positive manner about the traditional family unit. So whoever can afford to put up a big billboard that somehow promotes the traditional family and put it up in the middle of New York City, it's be a big mitzvah. Anyway, okay, let's see what else we got. Let's take a look here. So we're moving right along on this topic. All right, so on page 224, he actually discusses different forms of incest that are forbidden. And he starts with consanguinity, which is a word that I don't really hear too often, but it represents the idea of the familial relationships. Maternal relationships in particularly, in this case, for B'nai Noach, because family specifically that's paternal may not be on baseline Noahide law, may not be forbidden. So there's a couple of points about this. He brings out on page 225, by the way, in other words, particularly we're talking about mother and daughter, mother and sister, maternal sister. Those are the people that would be on baseline through family incest. Those are people not through marriage, but through family. Those would be the individuals that would be clearly forbidden and similar such relationships. So a lot of the things that are mentioned, a lot of the relationships that the Torah mentions are through marriage. But what about your mother? What about a person's mother's sister? So it seems like that would also be, of course, forbidden. Now, also want to add that he mentions in the book here that many Noahide societies have added relations through the father's side, paternal side, and also, additional relationships. And those are valid additions, forms of strengthening this Noahide law. He explains that due to how common human promiscuity has been in history, the paternity of a child is deemed uncertain in regards to the laws of incest, but not necessarily in relation to the laws. Not necessarily, but not true in regards to the laws of inheritance and in regards to the laws of honoring a father. So, in many areas of Noahide law, the father is deemed a certainty, and yet in regards to incest, it's not. One of the possible explanations that it could be for this is that, in a certain sense, incest is a bit of an innovation. I know this sounds so strange today, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe comments on the verse here, going back to the actually, interestingly enough, the same verse as I mentioned in Leviticus 18, verse 6, in which it ends up with the words, I am Hashem, or I am the Lord, right? I'm Lord. I am God. It's where it says, a man shall not approach his close relative to uncover their nakedness. I am Hashem. So Rashi there comments and brings, statements of our sages, that the idea is that, interesting, I don't see it at the moment in the Rashi. I know it's here somewhere. I just saw it a few moments ago. But the idea is that I am your God. I issued these decrees and you have to listen. That's basically the substance of it. I issued these decrees, these incest laws, and you must follow them. So the question is, why does it say that here? Why does it have to say, kind of warn, I am God in this context? So he gives a fascinating answer. And he says that, rationally speaking, a person might think that actually marrying a relative is a smart thing to do. I know we know genetically that it's problematic, but just from a common sense point of view, he says, look, if you're a relative, you may have more in common. You have similar values, similar experiences. You'd probably be easier to get along. So wouldn't it make sense, from a certain point of view, it might make more sense to marry a relative? Obviously, in ancient times, extended families became clans, became tribes, etc. So that's not such a strange thing to think that, that marrying within a family would not be a logical thing to do. Obviously, ancient kings, the pharaohs and something, they did this. They married within close relatives. So from a certain point of view, the prohibition of incest is a bit of an innovation. Now, you may think this sounds bizarre. Certainly in terms of the closest of relatives, like a sister or mother, those things do seem like these are people that the idea of a sexual relationship seems kind of repugnant and just inappropriate and doesn't seem to fit. It's not that this is, it's almost like ourselves, so to speak. It's just very different. There is an element, I think, in sexuality of kind of becoming whole or finding someone who's, being with someone who is strange, who is from the outside. But leaving that aside, there is a certain idea that there's an element of incest that's a divine decree that we may not understand it otherwise. So this helps us a little bit understand this rule for Noahides that paternal relatives on baseline are not prohibited because since there's some doubt brought into the equation based on historically, so because the whole idea of incest is an innovation, so we're going to limit it, and the Torah limits it for the nations. Also, it also complicates propagation of the species as well. When Israel was created, there already were a tribe, and there were multiple cousins and cousins of cousins, and there was no issue with a need to have an increased number of possible matches and mates, etc. So that might give some explanation as why this is the case. But again, Noahide law of most nations have broadened the category and included paternal relatives also. Now, he gives the example on page 225 of the story in which the conversation between Abraham and Abimelech, in which Abraham kind of excuses his behavior for calling Sarah his sister by saying, well, it was my father's daughter, but not my mother's daughter, right? So that seems to imply that you're allowed to marry your father's daughter because he's trying to excuse himself to Avimelech by saying, well, my wife is my sister, but a permitted sister. It's my father's daughter, but not from my mother's side. So that does seem to imply from Abraham's statement that was the case in those days, that it was seen as different. Okay. I mean, again, it's a little hard for us to understand nowadays, but if you think about it, in ancient times, men had multiple wives. Sometimes they may have had, scores of wives, So families were broken down into children of each wife. So, the in such a family of that size, the relationship between a child of one wife and another would have been very distant. And so paternal, so there would be, there could be a thought that maybe that's a kind of like a half distant relationship. It's more tribal than familial, if that makes any sense. You see what I'm saying? Powerful, sort of similar to what they say about, what was it, Genghis Khan, or some of these extremely powerful people that they had 1,000 wives. So obviously the idea that the children of these wives couldn't intermarry, on that level, it seems like they're more of a tribe than a family. Really. They're not very close. And your core family is your mother and your mother's children. So that might explain it also a little, to gain the perspective that they may have had in ancient times about paternal as opposed to maternal. Okay. So on page 226, he brings out a very strange, bizarre scenario that could arise from this rule about familiar forbidden relationships may not arise from the father. That what about a father and a daughter? I mean, if a child is not seen to have a familiar relationship with the father, then what about a father and a daughter? So he says, first of all, there are authorities that learn that there is actual biblical prohibition against that. And others maintain that the nations prohibited on their own. I mean, clearly we see from the story of Lot that was considered unacceptable and abhorrent to the nations when he had relations with his daughters, and Abraham wanted to distance himself from him. So clearly it was something that was unacceptable. Goes on to explain there in the second paragraph, 226, that the prohibition of a male having relations with their mother, it doesn't matter if his mother was his father's wife or he was conceived in any other fashion, even rape. Then he continues to talk about maternal aunts, sister of the mother or father, their views. That's forbidden. Again, I mean, really, currently these things, the aunt is an interesting question, whether that's, but I think currently it's not considered acceptable in the United States. I'd be interested to know what the current laws are about this in many states, but I think it's still something that's in many places not acceptable. Okay. Okay. In section B on page 227, goes on to speak about forbidden relatives through marriage, which includes the wife of a close relative, or the close relative of one's wife. So it's Rabbi Akiva's view that even for Noahides, biblically, man is forbidden to have relations or marry his father's wife, even after his father divorced the woman or the father passed away. Now, in the second category, close relatives of a person's wife, biblically, there's no prohibition to the nations at all. And he goes on to say that, again, it's like you have these different levels. There's the baseline, what's forbidden, and then there's things that are repugnant or became unacceptable, even though they're not biblically forbidden. So obviously the difference would be in terms of punishment, for one thing. And I guess under extreme circumstances, person would be permitted to have that relationship or have that marriage. Okay. For example, marrying a woman and her daughter. It does seem so wrong, doesn't it? It just really seems wrong. But in any event, he's saying here that there's those who say, there seems to be no opinions that hold that that's biblically forbidden, but yet it's a repellent practice among many nations, as is mentioned in the book Mitzvahs Hashem on page 398. You could look at that from footnote 47. And this would mean even after the passing of one of them, it would be forbidden to marry the stepdaughter or mother-in-law. Okay. There's another point I wanted to bring out, which is obvious from this whole discussion, but pornography. Is that something forbidden to Noahides or not? So again, it seems to me that, again, baseline, no, it's not forbidden. However, it's an outgrowth and a branch of offense that needs and is required to be created in order to avoid person falling into forbidden relationships because of the nature of pornography. And it's the, how shall I say, the perverse nature about it. In fact, again, there's this very interesting podcast that I was watching that was discussing this issue about the effects of pornography on Western sexuality. And I think one of the things I mentioned, this is all news to me. I had no idea. It's pretty horrible. They were talking about how, first of all, that evidently that it numbs people's sexual sensitivities, and then they seek more and more strange and bizarre sexual type acts, and just regular sexuality doesn't excite them at all. So obviously that itself undermines brings to forbidden relationships, because basically what happens is that regular familial traditional sex within marriage will not be sufficient to satisfy the person after they have numbed themselves to sexuality through watching a lot of pornography. And so they'll be pushed to stranger and stranger acts and behaviors and relationships. So it's clearly, as far as I'm concerned, it's clearly forbidden according to Noahide law, because it brings to the forbidden sexual relationships. There's no question about it. And again, in terms of what the way a proper Noahide society should work, you would have to forbid the dissemination of pornography. I know this might sound like, of course, duh, but I just want to point out how it's connected from the sources and from a halachic perspective. Obviously, it's not in the spirit of any type of divine or Judeo approach to life, but I want you to understand in terms of, how we can source this and halachically why that must be the case. So So I think that's important to understand. Okay. All right, now we're up to some really interesting things. People who have been with me for a while may recall some of this discussion in the past, but we're going to talk about Noahide marriage now. What is a Noahide marriage? And this is interesting because there are two parts of it. And there are different views of it. And it's in many ways, it's very similar to the structure of the Jewish Israelite marriage, but yet in some ways different. So, so what we're going to see here on page 228, and again, I'm just going to summarize, or you can look at it yourselves. But the first view, and I think it's a common view, but again, maybe it's kind of like a baseline view, is that sexual cohabitation with the intent to form a permanent relationship and a family unit constitutes a marriage for the nations. That's the first view. And it leads to an interesting conclusion that a lot of people today who have common law marriages and feel very comfortable just doing it and feel no need to have an official ceremony are actually correct. That is, there's nothing actually, technically, biblically wrong with that. As long as they're loyal to each other and understand that there's a betrayal and an adultery if they go outside of that relationship. So that's first of all. And that another thing about it is that even though the union was created through cohabitation, but it also needs to be a relationship that is notorious, so to speak. It's something that's publicized and something and therefore that they identify as a couple to the community. So that's another part of it. But that second element of it is not something that is not how it's consummated, but however, it is the way that part of the intention has to be also that should be the case. Now, there's another approach that says that, no, there's another level of marriage, even for Noahides, and that is that there has to be a financial responsibility as well. It has to be a financial, maybe even exchange as well. Interesting, and if you look up to 229, just that's where he talks about the point that I made. It's called mutual designation, in which they hold themselves out to be a couple, living together and also acting in a manner that they're a couple, they're a family. And he says that in the Jewish sources that this is often found as a description of Noahide marriage. As if you look in footnote 50, the Torah Tamima, which is a commentary, well-known commentary on the 5 books. Actually, I think you may even go on the whole Tanakh, but makes this comment in Genesis that the two people are designated for each other. So there's a good line there in that paragraph where he says the term mutually designated signifies a loyal sexual union of a man and a woman living together in one dwelling. So I think that's basically the baseline identifiable of what constitutes a Noahide marriage. Baseline is that loyal sexual union in which they live together in one dwelling. So in other words, based on that, a lot of people are, quote, living together. That's a Noahide marriage. And breaking up dissolves the Noahide marriage. However, the intent should be really to stay together forever at the moment that they consummate it. It shouldn't be with an intent to break it up. Okay. Although I don't know if that's an actual condition that they well, yeah, actually interesting. He says it right over here in the next sentence. It includes the notion that the designation has been made with the intention of a permanent union, not a temporary one. And he quotes the Rabbi of Lubavitch about that. Okay. So in the next paragraph, in the 29, he explains that there's another opinion, as I began saying, that a financial commitment is made primarily to the wife. Obviously, I mean, the woman also makes a sort of financial commitment to the husband, and just in terms of taking upon herself domestic responsibilities, which in itself obviously has a monetary, as also an imputed value, because of all the people you'd have to hire to do the myriad of work and skill and everything else that a woman does in the house, for heaven's sake. It's unbelievable, right? You try to get someone to do everything that a wife does in the house. It's $100,000 right there to get all that done. All right. So he goes on to explain that the difference, according to the second view, between a wife with financial responsibility towards her, and that also means that her children will be the man's heirs. He says that according to this view, there's something called a concubine and there's something called a wife. In Hebrew, kilegesh, and the concubine is strictly a sexual relationship, although you're also having children with the man's having children with the woman, but the children don't inherit. And the same financial responsibility to that woman doesn't exist. So there seems to be, in other words, and we see this, the point is we see this in the Torah. So the commentaries are simply, extrapolating and seeing the examples that we see in Torah from Hagar, that she was a concubine, and it seems to be the relationship with her, although it does say Abraham gave her children gifts, but they didn't inherit the estate. So that does imply that there is a responsibility to give them something. He gave Keturah, although it doesn't say anything about Ishmael, that he got anything. He was sent away. So we don't know what happened to him, but he lost his marriage because of his behavior. And I guess it would be permitted to, disinherit, but here it's not inheritance, but the point is to refuse to give a gift. But the children of Keturah, Abraham, the verse says expressly, in the parasha of Chaye Sarah, the years of Sarah, there it says expressly that the sons of Keturah were given gifts by Abraham, then they were sent to the east. So if you look at the middle paragraph on page 230, he explains this paradigm as follows. It is possible that people, when they married, according to Noahide law, through entering a sexual relationship, would write a marriage contract together with gifts. And for those whom they wished to retain as a concubine and could send away when they wanted, and whose sons would not be amongst their heirs, they would not write a financial commitment. So in other words, the financial commitment was actually a financial commitment upon the severance of the marriage. There may have also been a financial commitment upon entry of the marriage. But it's a little bit implied from the fact that he says on one hand, there's a marriage contract with gifts and a financial commitment. On the other one, there's a concubine who could be sent away whenever the man wished. Seems to imply that in the first case, there is something even in Noahide law like a ketubah. A ketubah is in which when a woman is divorced or becomes widowed, that she gets a certain amount of money from the estate. Obviously, the important part of that is for according to current Noahide standards, because we already have inheritance upon when a woman becomes a widow from her husband. But in the case of divorce, not necessarily, although generally in the courts they have that too. But there's an idea of a ketubah in which a certain amount of money has to be paid to the woman. The man can't just divorce her. He has a significant financial responsibility towards her, which initially in the Jewish law, this is enough money for her to survive at least a year, maybe it's 2 years or something like that. A certain amount of time to give her, in other words, up front, a full support, which in other words, it's at a minimum like, I don't know, $200,000 or something. But the other thing that you have in Jewish law is that a woman can opt to remain on the estate and not take her to ketubah and then eat off the estate for her survival, just for food and basics. And that's another thing that is part of the halacha. So that's something interesting. But obviously, she can't remarry and continue living off the estate. So that would only as long as a woman is not married. Now, would that apply exactly in this case? I don't know. But what we do know is that it appears that the financial commitment was probably one in which you said, and if I divorce you, or if I don't, then I need to give you such and such and such. The person couldn't just be tossed aside. However, the concubine, and by the way, don't forget the concubine is consensual also. It has to be consensual. I don't know if I brought that out clearly before. But the relationship that consummates in a marriage, even under Noahide law as well as Jewish law, both men and women must consent to it. So a man can't force a woman into a marriage. Okay. He goes on to say there are other sources that I guess they're similar to in a Jewish marriage where both men and women have obligations towards each other. So also the point is that under the more complex, the more dignified or level 2 marriage 2.0 of Noahide, the financial obligations would be recorded in a financial document. Again, similar to a ketubah. Page 231, he says something that I already mentioned to you, which is that even in the first situation, in which there's a common law marriage in which the two people designate each other as sexual partners and live together, adultery would apply in that situation. Oh, this is actually, though, interesting, is that it could be that some of these living together situations are not marriages. Actually, matter of fact, many of them, because the parties don't intend to make a permanent husband-wife relationship. It's not their intent to do that. Their intent is simply as for convenience and as friends and to have a sexual relationship, but just as friends. If that's not the case, then no marriage is formed and there wouldn't be adultery either. So I guess that's a good thing from a certain point of view. Any questions about any of this? Any thoughts? Any of this?